Thank you, Martin, for the introduction. We were certainly very lucky to have chosen this year to take a 2-month holiday at the beginning of the year. We left Southampton on the cruise ship Arcadia on Friday the 3rd of January, headed south to Madeira, and then we crossed the Atlantic to the Caribbean. From there we went through the Panama Canal, which was a first for Rose and I, and then up the coast of America via Guatemala and Mexico to San Francisco. From San Francisco, we crossed the Pacific, arriving in Auckland on Saturday, the 15th of February. We then spent around 2 weeks touring North Island in one of my former colleagues' motorhomes before flying back to Birmingham from Auckland via Dubai. So we're very lucky we didn't encounter any issues with COVID. So some of the places we visited had some items of interest potentially to our members and viewers tonight. And these are the places that I'm going to concentrate on in the presentation. So starting in the Caribbean with Barbados and Curacao, I'm going to talk a bit about the Panama Canal, followed by San Francisco, then in Auckland, the Museum of Transport and Technology. Then we went to Coromandel Peninsula, the Driving Creek Railway. I'm going to talk a bit about items we saw in Napier, then move on to the Glenbrook Vintage Railway, the Cowrie Museum, and finally back in Auckland in the Auckland Memorial Museum. So in Barbados, we actually went on an organised trip from the cruise ship, quite fortuitously, although I was planning to visit this railway anyway. This railway, the St Nicholas Abbey Heritage Railway, is a purpose-built 2-foot 6-inch gauge railway that's around 0.9 of a mile long round the grounds of St Nicholas Abbey. St Nicholas Abbey is an estate which comprises a plantation house dating from 1658, a museum and a rum distillery. The railway was built as recently as 2018, so it was built totally from scratch, and operations started on the 21st of January 2019 with a diesel service. It was then officially opened on the 11th of March 2019 by the Prime Minister of Barbados, who tolled a locomotive bell, which actually came from one of the Baldwin locos that ran on the original railway network in Barbados, which was also 2-foot 6-inch gauge, but closed many years ago. So this is the locomotive that hauled our train. It's an articulated Malay type locomotive built by the Arnold Jung Works in Germany in 1914. And it operated in a sugar mill in Java. It was bought by Graham Lee at the Statfold Barn Railway. I'm sure many of you know of the Statfold Barn Railway. It's a private line, now part of a trust, that was set up by Graham Lee some years back. And this particular locomotive was restored to working order in the workshops at Statfold in 2018 and 2019 before being shipped to Barbados in 2019. And I was very lucky because of my connections with Statfold, where I volunteer. I actually had a ride on the footplate of the locomotive, so that was a bit of extra entertainment for me. Since we visited in January, a second locomotive has been supplied by Statfold Barn Railway, and this is a Lamers 040 tank. They've also got a couple of Hudswell Clark diesel locomotives, again supplied from Statfold Barn. They were the ex-Shotton Steelworks. Just to give you an idea of what the railway looks like, this is a short video which shows the railway. You can see it's laid with fairly substantial earthworks, and the The cost of building this railway was around about $1 million US. You can see there's a cutting there. The railway, the train proceeds at a fairly sedate pace and has 3 coaches, but there's a commentary, very interesting commentary from the onboard train guides, quite interesting gardens and landscaping around the grounds of the plantation. But it's predominantly a tourist line, and I think they were hoping to cash in on the business from cruise ships visiting Barbados, of which a lot of cruise ships traditionally or normally would visit. So they must be seeing a massive loss in income with the COVID situation. After we visited the railway, we called to visit this windmill, the Morgan Lewis windmill, and this is actually the last of one of many sugarcane mills in Barbados. It was built in 1727 to drive a mill for crushing sugarcane. It stopped working in 1947 and was given to the Barbados National Trust in 1962. And as I say, it's one of only 2 working sugar windmills in the world. Our next port of call is Curaçao, which is one of the ABC islands. This had a very interesting bridge, which is of a design that I certainly hadn't come across previously. It's a pontoon bridge which connects the 2 districts of Willemstad, the capital. It was built in 1888 by Leonard Burlington Scott. It's 548 foot long and 32 foot wide. Originally it carried vehicles, but since 1974, when the modern Queen Juliana Bridge opened further upstream, it has been pedestrian only. The opposite end to the hinge is hinged at on the far side. So on the far side in both of the pictures here, there is a hut. You can see the cream-coloured hut, from which the operator controls 2 diesel engines which drive propellers mounted perpendicular to the bridge. This will become somewhat clearer in this video. So this is a video of the pontoon bridge opening to allow a small boat to come through. As you can see, there's still people on the bridge. There's no health and safety to stop people falling off the end of the bridge. The bridge itself bounces up and down on the seawater in the estuary. In fact, it's quite a strange sensation. You can see the 2 blue housings for the diesel engines, and it's a bit like a sort of 2 outboard engine motors, like you would see on the back of I guess on the back of a boat. So it in this case it's only hinged opened a small distance to allow this small ship to go through. But when larger ships are on stream, the bridge opens to the full width of the estuary, and there's a ferry which they lay on for the duration that the bridge is open. You'll just catch the bridge, the modern bridge, just in the extreme right-hand corner of the video. Another place worth visiting Curaçao, if you have time, is this small maritime museum. It opened in 1998 and is housed in an old colonial 2-storied mansion which was built in 1729. Was burnt down in 1988, but rebuilt in the same year. And just an example of some of the exhibits in the Maritime Museum: ship models, models of ships' engines, various ornaments, and a figurehead from a ship which sunk off of Curaçao. So from Curaçao, we headed to the Panama Canal, and I have to say this was one of the highlights of the cruise. The map here shows the route in red of the Panama, of the ships take through the Panama Canal. So the Atlantic Ocean in the top left-hand corner, or the Caribbean Sea, and the Pacific Ocean in the top, in the bottom right-hand corner. I'd always assumed, I must admit, without consulting maps, because I'm not a geographer, that the Panama Canal would have basically gone east-west through the Isthmus of Panama, but in fact, initially you go in a southerly direction, and then you head in a southeasterly direction. So to go from the Atlantic Ocean direction, you go up through 3 locks known as the Gatun locks, and then you go into the Gatun Lake, and then you go through a cutting, the Gaillard Cut, and then you go out through another 3 locks, the Pedro Miguel locks and the Miraflores locks. The section at the bottom gives you some idea of the arrangement. So you've got 3 locks on the Atlantic side and a series of 3 locks on the Pacific side, with the Gaillard Cut in the well, about 2/3 of the way through. The history of the canal, I think most people probably know about, but just to summarize, the first attempt at building a canal was inspired by Ferdinand de Lesseps. He's the chap that was involved with constructing the Suez Canal, and began on June the 1st, 1881. Sadly, around 22,000 men lost their lives due to a combination of tropical diseases and accidents between then and 1889, when the French company that was building it went bankrupt. In 1894, a second French company took over, but that was then purchased by the United States. They took over work on the canal construction in 1904, and the canal finally opened on the 15th of August 1914. There was then a treaty that was signed, I think, by Jimmy Carter, which formally handed over the canal from the United States to Panama, and they took over the administration and operation of the canal on December the 31st, 1999. They then embarked on an expansion program in 2007, which I'll talk about later, with the new expanded canal opening in 2016. So this was the view from the balcony, our balcony on the ship. I think you can see rows of the binoculars just to the left there. This was as we approached the locks on the Atlantic side. So we're going up through the locks, and there is a ship coming down through the other set of locks, coming down the canal to join the Atlantic Ocean. This is a close-up as we headed a bit nearer. Now, on the original canal locks, you have a series of mules which they run on a 5-foot gauge track with a rack down the middle. You can see the rack. They're basically locomotives, but they're called mules. The original ones were built by General Electric when the canal was built, but the current mules were built by Mitsubishi a few years back, and they're basically used to provide side-to-side control of the ships within the locks, and also to provide braking control of the ships. The ships use their own propulsion system as well for forward movement, but the mules control the braking and the side-to-side motion. This will become a little bit clearer from this video. So this is the mule in operation. You can see the 2 lines from the mules. These are actually going slack if they're about to let go of the line. So the mules are fitted with powerful winches which connect the lines to the ship. And there's usually 2 mules each side of the ship at the front, and 2 mules on the stern each side. A number of Panama Canal pilots board the ship, and they work in conjunction with the mule drivers, radio contact and bell contact. So you can just see they're dropping off the lines now from the front of the bulk carrier, as it's basically come out the final lock and is heading in the Atlantic, in the direction of the Atlantic Ocean. Some parts of the track are quite steep, and there's the need for the rack. There's also a turntable sort of points system for shunting the locomotives back to the opposite end. This is a shot taken as we're approaching the Miraflores locks. So just to explain this picture, the Miraflores locks that we're heading towards on the left-hand side of the picture, and on the right-hand side of the picture is part of the new canal. So they're basically built a wider set of locks. So the old locks could accommodate ships up to 965 foot in length and 106 foot in width. The new locks, and this is a picture of a ship coming out on the Pacific side of the new locks, can accommodate much longer ships, so up to 1,200 foot and 160 foot wide. Now the new locks are designed so they don't need to use mules, and they actually use tugs in a fairly conventional way. I think there's space to accommodate the tugs in the new locks. So the bigger ships go through the new locks, mainly container ships, but the older size ships, which are to the Panamax standard, go through the original locks, and we went through the original locks. But it's a very interesting experience if you haven't done it before. This was an interesting crane that we spotted on our way through. This was built by DMAG in Bremerhaven in 1941 for the Kriegsmarine. It was actually used for maintenance on U-boats and has a lifting capacity of some 349 tons. It was seized as a war prize at the end of the war and dismantled and transported across the Atlantic to the Long Beach Naval Yard, and it was used there till 1994. And it was in fact used in 1980 to move the Hughes Spruce Goose into the geodesic dome next to the Queen Mary. I think it's since moved into another hangar. Anyway, the crane was sold in 1996 to the Panama Canal Commission, where it is now used to help with the maintenance of the lock gates. So it's a massive thing with a lifting capacity of some 349 metric tons and is 374 foot high. Quite an impressive crane. So we now headed up to San Francisco, and the weather deteriorated considerably. San Francisco, obviously, it's their winter. It was pretty miserable weather the 2 days we were in San Francisco. But one of the things we visited in San Francisco was this Liberty ship. It's the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, which is one of the classes of 2,710 Liberty cargo ships that were built by the United States during the Second World War. And these were virtually mass produced. She was built in fact in 56 days in 1943 at the New England Shipbuilding Corporation in South Portland, Maine. The keel was laid down on the 6th of May 1943, and she was actually launched on the 19th of June 1943. In total, she made 4 round-trip convoy crossings across the Atlantic and 11 English Channel crossings to support the invasion. She was taken out of service in 1946 and kept mothballed in the reserve fleet until 1979, when she was acquired for preservation. She was restored to seagoing condition in time to take part in the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landings. She actually crossed the Atlantic and took part in the D-Day landings. So this is a shot in the engine room. She has a single 2,500 horsepower triple expansion steam engine and 2 Foster Wheeler oil-fired boilers. These are just a few general shots. Many of the auxiliaries are steam powered, so steam powered winch on the deck there, steam powered generators, bottom left, and a typical electric switchboard on the bottom right hand corner. Very interesting to look around the ship. Lots to see, and the volunteers are interesting to talk to as well. Next to the Jeremiah O'Brien is a submarine. This is a Baleo class submarine, a diesel electric submarine. This was built in a fairly short time, not quite as short time, but the keel was laid down on the 15th of March 43, and she was launched on the 12th of July 43, and she was actually in service until 1971. She was turned into a museum in 1975. You can actually go on the submarine, but I didn't have time to go on the submarine. Propulsion is four. Sorry about that. 4 diesels driving the generators to charge 2,126 cell batteries. And then there's 4 high-speed electric motors. We visited a few other things in San Francisco, of course. Top left is the Pier 43 arch, or what remains of it. You can see the Jeremiah O'Brien in the background. This was a head house that was used as a hoisting tower for loading and unloading rail cars onto train ferries. It was built in 1914 to serve the Belt Railroad. Another interesting thing there is this vintage Mack fire engine. You can go on tours around in the city and that. In the museum, we spotted this steam-powered motorbike. This was built in around 1912 by a chap called Niles Gillingwater. Looks quite a beast. Also close to the where the ship's dock is the F-line streetcar line. So this is a conventional tram line. It's not cable cars. And on this line, they operate a number of heritage trams, or streetcars as they're called in San Francisco. And I think this line was opened in 1995. Following day, we headed to Golden Gate Bridge, and the weather really was dreadful there. It was pouring with rain. The construction of the Golden Gate Bridge began on the 5th of January 1933, and it actually opened ahead of schedule on the 27th of May 1937. Its chief engineer was Joseph Strauss, although the engineer that was credited with the design and most of the work was Charles Alton Ellis. He was the leading contributor to the design. Its cost was $35 million back in the 30s. That's equivalent to about 500 million US dollars in today's values. And until 1964, when it was overtaken by the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, it had the longest suspension bridge main span in the world at some 4,200 feet. So we're now moving on to New Zealand, having called at Hawaii and Tahiti on the way across the Pacific. And we visited the Auckland Museum of Transport and Technology. This is a fantastic museum and is an absolute must for any industrial archaeologist visiting Auckland. Anybody really. There's a lot of stuff there. It opened in 1964 based on 2 sites. The first site is called Motap 1, which is centered around the site of a beam engine house that originally provided Auckland's water supply. And about 2 kilometres away, there is a large aviation collection and a demonstration steam railway. And the 2 sites are linked by a dual gauge tramway. And this is dual gauge 4 foot and 4 foot 8.5. So you travel between the 2 sites by tram, and also it connects to one of the large car parks. We were there on a weekend when they had a lot of events on it. It was very busy. We had quite a bit of difficulty in finding somewhere to park. So Motap 1 is centered around the Western Springs pumping station. This was designed by the city engineer William Errington, who was an engineer who was trained in the UK. He was commissioned by the Auckland City Council in 1874 to design the Western Springs pumping station and associated reservoirs and pipelines. Prior to its construction, Auckland had suffered from terrible water shortages, and as a consequence, there were obviously public health issues, but also they had considerable losses from fires because there was a shortage of water for firefighting. So the main engine in the pumping station is a beam engine that was built by John Key and Sons of Kirkcaldy. It's a wharf double compound and could pump some 1 million gallons in 12 hours. It has a 16.3 ton, 6.25 metre diameter flywheel and 7.3 metre beam, operates twin pumps, raising the water from the Ponsonby Reservoir. So these are the cylinders at the opposite end, or the valves controlling steam to the cylinders at the opposite end of the engine. And the system, the pumping station, brought huge benefits to the city when it was first commissioned in March 1879. The pumps served Auckland until 1910, at which point adequate water from the Waitakere ranges became available to Auckland. And about 10 years later, the Western Springs shown significant signs of pollution. So they were used, after 1920, they were used in emergencies only. And by 1936, it was recommended that the machinery be scrapped and the original boilers were removed the following year. Fortunately, the engine remained in situ. Next to the beam engine is the old boiler house, which houses a number of stationary steam engines and also a boiler providing steam to the beam engine and to these stationary steam engines. So in the foreground here, the blue coloured engine is a Tangy steam pump, which was originally installed in 1905 in a different location to supply water to the Devonport area of Auckland, the other side of the harbour from Auckland. And this is a 1910 Tangy 47 horsepower engine that was used until 1927 when it fell into disuse, but this has been relocated in the stationary engine hall at Motat. Also in the stationary engine house is a triple expansion engine. This was built in 1910 by Campbell and Calderwood of Paisley, and it's understood it was installed in the Sydney ferry, the Greycliff. Sadly, the ferry was tragically sunk when it was cut in two by the Union steamship mail steamer, the Tahiti, with a loss of 40 lives. But the engine was salvaged in 1928 and shipped to New Zealand, where she was installed in a dairy factory, where it drove ammonia compressors from 1938 to 1968. And this is a video of the engine operating up the steam. So when it was salvaged, the flywheel was installed with grooves on it to provide rope drive to the motor compressors that were part of the refrigeration plant in the dairy. So, and all the engines in the engine house, including the beam engine, are steamed at regular intervals during the open days. This was a little Bellis and Morecambe steam-driven generator, again supplied for freezing activities apparently, but it's a generator rather than driving compressors. So a couple of pictures of the trams. This is a tram that was used in Wellington. The Wellington trams were 4-foot gauge. They have quite an extensive fleet of trams. This particular one was built in 1906 and used until 1954. And then this is one of the 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge trams. This was a Melbourne tram built in 1945 and used in Melbourne until 1997. when it was shipped over to New Zealand. This is one of the intermediate stations with a passing loop on the tram line between the two sites. So we then headed to MOTAT 2, to the Sir Keith Park Memorial Aviation Collection. I have to say that I wasn't quite sure who Sir Keith Park was. I'm sure most of you know, but just to remind you, Air Chief Marshal Sir Keith Park, highly decorated. He was a New Zealander who first served with the Anzac Brigade in Gallipoli. Not content with this, he transferred to the British Army, where he was wounded during the Battle of the Somme and declared unfit for active service. He transferred again, this time to the Royal Flying Corps, flying Bristol fighters. He was credited with downing 20 enemy aircraft. During this period, he was awarded a Military Cross and Bar, as well as the Distinguished Flying Cross. In 1918, Park joined the newly formed Royal Air Force, and by 1938, he'd been appointed a staff officer to Air Chief Marshal Dowding, with whom he helped to devise the strategy for fighter command that was to win the Battle of Britain. So a few shots here of the inside of this hangar. Quite an assortment of aircraft here. Just pick out one or two of the things that caught my eye. This is a Sunderland Mark V flying boat that served with the New Zealand Air Force from 1953 to 1965. I'm sure the aircraft enthusiasts amongst you will recognise some of the other planes. And then another Shorts plane. This is the Shorts Solent Mark IV flying boat, which was formerly used by Tasman Empire Airways Limited, firstly between Auckland Harbour and Sydney. But then it was superseded by conventional propeller-driven aircraft, conventional wheeled aircraft. It was redeployed on the iconic Coral route from Auckland to Fiji, Samoa, etc., until again it was superseded by conventional aircraft in September 1960. Another shot of aircraft in the hangar. Just single out the Lancaster in the background there. This is a Mark VII Lancaster. It was built in 1945, but didn't actually see any war service. She passed to the French Navy for service as a maritime patrol aircraft in East Africa and the South Pacific before being acquired by the museum in 1964. Also at the MOTAT 2 site is the Western Springs Railway. This is a 1 kilometre long, 3-foot 6-inch gauge demonstration line with a selection of former New Zealand Railway locomotives and rolling stock. This is an Avonside class, L class locomotive built in 1877. You can have a ride on the line. A few other odds and sods are spotted. MOTAT 2, jet engine, ammonia compressor bottom left. The sign bottom right rather tickled me. This was on a portable loo, porter loo type structure. Rather tickled us. Anyway, we then moved on to the Coromandel Peninsula. Bit tenuous industrial archaeology connection, but this line is a 15-inch gauge railway that was built by the late Barry Brickell initially just to provide access to the clay and the wood fuel for his pottery. But the line developed such that it opened to the public in 1990. The map on the left gives you some idea of the complexity of the line. It uses a number of switchbacks, I think 5 in total, to gain height. It uses a spiral, has a double-decker bridge. It's some 2.6 kilometres in length, and there's a height gain of 100 metres. Steepest gradient is 1 in 15. It really is fantastic. If you're up that way, it's a must-visit place. This is a shot from the diesel hydraulic rail car that takes you around. We were lucky to be the only people on this first train in the morning. This is a shot of the double-decker bridge, which is quite a novelty, I have to say. This is one of the reversing points for gaining height. You reverse, and you can get some idea of the gradient of the the tracks in this picture. The line, the extreme right hand corner, is actually a siding, but you come up the line to the left, you reverse, change the points, and then you head on up. It really is something else, and obviously we've got the sort of semi-tropical forest scenery as well. And it takes you to a station at the top with a nice little pun to a viewing tower called the Foote Tower. It's quite amusing. This is some 567 feet above sea level, and fantastic view, 360-degree view from this tower. I say, well worth a visit. We headed from the Coromandel. We headed south down to Napier, with the prime intention of visiting the Faraday Centre, which I knew about. This is the Hawke's Bay Museum of Technology, which began in 1979, and is actually housed in the building that was constructed in 1913 as a power station for Napier's trams. When we arrived at this little museum, this traction engine was parked outside. They were visiting for the weekend, so we had a bit of a chat with the crew. Now, the power plant, the original power plant, was quite interesting. Bottom picture here shows the original power plant. It was 3 215 horsepower Westinghouse gas engines driving 137 kilowatt 460 volt DC generators. So you can see the three engines there, and the gas for powering these 3 gas engine driven generators was made in a producer gas plant on site. So the 2 upper photographs show you the original producer gas plant, so the gas holder and the gas producing plant. So they use coal basically to make producer gas, which then supplied the gas to the engines to run the generators. They later, in 1916, they added a big battery bank, so that when the engines were shut down, when the trams stopped running, power could be supplied from the battery banks for the street lighting in the city. In the early 1920s, Napier began changing from DC to AC. So they placed an order with English Electric in Rugby for a diesel generating set. This is the unit pictured here. This is in the museum in its original location in the original powerhouse. So the parts supplied by English Electric was a 600 horsepower 4Q size diesel engine coupled to a 3.3 kV 500 kVA alternator, which was manufactured at English Electric's Stafford Works. The engine's quite interesting. It's a 2-stroke diesel with opposed pistons made to a design patented by Hugh Francis Fulliger in 1909. The plant was completed in 1925, but it was April 1927 before it completed its commissioning trials. However, only 2 months later, in July 1927, Napier actually began receiving power from a hydroelectric plant some 200 kilometres south of Napier. And this meant that the engine was then relegated to standby duties. So when there was water shortages or the transmission lines were down, was the only time the engine was run. However, as many of you know, Napier was hit by a devastating earthquake on the 3rd of February 1931 at 10:47 a.m. This earthquake measured 7.9 on the Richter scale. The power station building was badly damaged and the battery destroyed. But when the building was made safe, the diesel generating unit was able to run again, and it continued supplying electricity to the devastated town while the town was rebuilt. This engine is, I think, is the only potentially operational Fulliger diesel generating set in the world. There are a number of other engines in underground power stations, principally in Gibraltar and Malta, but they're in a terrible state and never likely to run. This engine, if it was fitted with a silencer, I believe could actually run, although it doesn't actually run in the museum. The museum is quite an interesting mixture of technology and science. You can see a robot in the middle background there. There's various hands-on exhibits for the kids, different sorts of stationary engines, steam engines, a lot of sort of social history type displays, shops, radio, telephony, real interesting range of things in quite a small museum, which is basically run by volunteers. Another picture there from the gallery area, the mezzanine floor area. A lot of interesting displays. We were very fortunate, and it wasn't planned, that we actually arrived in Napier on the Art Deco Festival weekend. Every year they have this Art Deco Festival weekend in February, and we just happened to arrive on that weekend. When Napier was rebuilt in the 1930s, many of the buildings were made from concrete in an Art Deco style. In fact, top left, you can see one of the Art Deco buildings there, and some of the Art Deco structures top right. And basically, thousands of people descend on the city to celebrate everything Art Deco. People dress up in the period costume. There's hundreds of vintage and veteran cars of different sorts from the 1930s and similar time. Various musical events. There was an air display in the evening. Fantastic time to visit Napier. We were only there for a day, but we got a good taste of it. From Napier, we moved to the Glenbrook Vintage Railway. This is a 7.4 kilometre long heritage line, which operates on a part of an old branch line. And I was very lucky there again to get a footplate ride on the loco, thanks to the driver. So that was an interesting ride. This is the station at the Glenbrook end with our train. I rode in the carriage on the way up the line, but on the way back, I was on the footplate. On the way back, they call at the workshops at Pukewarie. You can visit the workshops. Quite a bit going on there. This wheel turning lathe caught my eye. This is a Loudon Brothers wheel turning lathe. They were specialists in wheel turning lathes. We then moved on to the Cowrie Museum, which basically tells the story of the Cowrie tree and the people and the social history associated with the industries that were developed to harvest the Cowrie timber. Agathis australis, commonly known by its Maori name Cowrie, is a coniferous tree found north of the 38-degree latitude line in the northern districts of New Zealand's North Island. Although its use today is much more restricted, in the past the size and the strength of the Cowrie timber made it a popular wood for construction and shipbuilding, particularly for the masts of sailing ships because of its parallel grain and the absence of branches for much of its height. And the Cowrie crown and stump wood was much appreciated for its beauty and was very sought after for ornamental wood panelling. And there are many examples of high-end furniture in this museum. I'll concentrate on the mechanical items. So outside the museum is this steam-hauled log hauler, which was made by the Whangarei Engineering Company in 1913, 13.5 horsepower from 2 8-inch bore cylinders. Inside, a couple of portable engines caught my eye, a Garrett and a Davy Paxman. There's a selection of specialized saws. This is a saw for slicing bulks of timber into planks in one take. They've constructed a sawmill replica showing a typical sawmill, how it's arranged, and can be driven from an electric motor to show it working. There's replica workshops, a whole display of stationary engines, chainsaws, all sorts of interesting things like that. And then outside the museum, this rather tickled us. This is a Nissan Leaf, but it was the registration plate that caught our eyes. EV, come on and plug me in, it says on the registration plate, and it was plugged into the charger outside the museum. So we then headed back to Auckland, where we visited the Auckland War Memorial Museum. This opened in 1929, And there was a big architectural competition that was funded by the Royal Institute of British Architects back in the 1920s. And an Auckland firm, Grierson, Ulmer and Draffin, they won the competition with their neoclassical building, which was reminiscent of Greco-Roman temples, I guess. So there are three principal connections in the museum: documentary heritage, so archives and the like; natural sciences, dinosaurs and fossils and stuffed birds of all sorts; and human history. So the human history part covers the number of exhibits related to the war, or wars, I should say, military history. Anyway, a couple of things caught my eye. This is a Mark 16 Spitfire, built in 1945, commissioned in 1951, and only has 638 flying hours on it, apparently. And this is right up in the top of the museum. It was the most unlikely thing to find, but I guess they must have craned it in before they put the roof on. Next to that, this is an interesting engine. It's as far as known, it is the oldest surviving Merlin engine in the world. It's the 30th Merlin engine manufactured, and there's a Merlin Model F, of which only 20 were built. It was dispatched on the 3rd of February 1937, when it was installed in a Fairey Battle. Fairey Battle is a single-engine monoplane light bomber. It saw service in the Fairey Battle before being sectioned by the workshops of the No. 4 maintenance unit at RAF Ruislip, and was sent to New Zealand in 1940 to be part of the New Zealand Centennial Exhibition, which was to celebrate 100 years since the Waitangi Treaty was signed on the 6th of February 1840. Due to the conflict, its return to the UK was delayed, and it was finally donated to the Auckland War Memorial Museum. Next to the Spitfire is a Mitsubishi Model Zero. Have to say, Model 22 Zero. Have to say, I didn't know much about this plane, but a little bit of research. It's considered to be one of the most capable carrier-based fighters in the world when it was first introduced in World War II, early in World War II, and some nearly 11,000 were built between 1939 and 1945. And Captain Eric Winkle Brown, well known to most of you, I would think, he recalled being impressed by the Zero during tests of captured aircraft. And his words were, "I don't think I've ever flown a fighter that could match the rate of turn of the Zero. The Zero had ruled the roost totally and was the finest fighter in the world until mid-1943. So that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my presentation for this evening.